Hey everyone, this is Rock from StageandSky.com, and this is the third way that reading the Bible from cover to cover has changed my life. It explains human behavior. By human behavior, yes, I'm talking about all humans, all mankind. The Bible explains it so it's not so frustrating. You can love people a lot more. You can have a little bit more compassion when you understand how we work. So, psychology. Psychology is the study of the mind and behavior. I could go to school and spend years studying the greats like Freud or Pavlov or Carl Jung, or I could just pick up and read the Bible. I'm not knocking those men or their work, but who better to find out the truth about ourselves than from the one who created us? First off, God made human beings in his image. That alone should give you some indication that we're more than just mere creatures. The book of Genesis teaches us that God gave us dominion over all creatures on the planet. I'm pointing this out not to rile up animal lovers, but to emphasize how much God favors us as human beings. And what if I told you that not only did he create us in his image, he also embedded in us the feelings, instincts, a sense of right and wrong? How many times have you heard this? I'm not a Christian, I'm not a believer, but I'm still a good person. You can be a moral person without being Christian. Not only have I heard it, I've actually seen examples of it. I've met self-proclaimed atheists who almost put me to shame in the way that they live their lives, meaning how helpful they are. They're very self-sacrificing. They're putting others before themselves. They almost seem more Christian than myself, and yet they don't believe in God, Jesus, or the Bible. That's a bit strange, no? In reading the Bible from cover to cover, I've come to understand why this is the case. In my last point about how the world makes sense, I explain why things are happening. The book of Deuteronomy is a list of cause and effects, where God lays out good things will happen if we obey and bad things if we disobey. Then there was a question of why God made these rules to begin with. I made an illustration about a loving father looking out for us, his children, as we navigated the world. But really it's much deeper than that. The Apostle Paul teaches in several scriptures that as a grand creator, God imprinted his moral law into the conscience of every human being ever created, whether they know him or not. This means that all people who ever lived, the natives in America, who never knew a world beyond the Atlantic, the Chinese, the Japanese, all of mankind was not only created in God's image, Jehovah's image, but they knew right and wrong because God's moral law was embedded in them. You could argue that no, it's all about common sense and the golden rule, doing unto others as you want others to do to you. But how did you get that wisdom and common sense? Experience? Trial and error? Was it passed down from your parents? Who passed it down to them? In Acts 14:16-17, Paul says, in past generations, God allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. In Romans chapter 2, verse 13-15, Paul explains, for it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles, those are people who aren't Jews, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Now that sounds like a mouthful, alright, so bear with me as I break it down. What this shows, as Pastor John MacArthur notes in his study Bible, is that our conscience has an innate warning system when we're doing what's wrong, regardless of whether or not you've been taught the scriptures. When you do what's wrong, it's this trigger that activates in your body because you're choosing to ignore or disobey that moral law. If you do this enough times, you become desensitized to your own conscience, eventually silencing it. And of course I have Ted Bundy here, and if you guys don't know who he is, I mean, geez, he killed a lot of women, and he was a textbook sociopath. And I can't gloss over it, but I mentioned the innate warning system that triggers when you know you're doing something was wrong, right? I think everyone feels that. You didn't have to be told you can't do this, or I shouldn't do this, or I shouldn't take this without permission. You already knew this in your heart, right? Ever since you were a kid. Instead of looking at the Bible as a book of rules, it might be good to see it as a book of warning signs. Alright, so why would he give us these warnings? Because he knows us. God has feelings, he has emotions. The book, it talks about him being a jealous God, and a book of wrath, but also peace and of love. He gave us those same feelings and emotions in varying levels. In reading the Bible, I've come to understand his judgment, but without those feelings that he gave us, there's no way anyone would even come close to grasp his logic or reason. For instance, in the Old Testament, which teaches us more about God's character, while the New Testament teaches us about Jesus and what's to come. But in the Old Testament, there's instances of God more or less sanctioning the destruction and genocide of people inhabiting the land of Canaan. This is the land he promised to give to the Israelites as part of the covenant he made with Abraham. Genocide is awful, right? I mean, we compare it to the Holocaust or the Nanjing massacre, and no matter how many ways you slice it, there's nothing we can say that could ever justify those atrocities. But if it's sanctioned and ordered by God, then can we justify it? Then can we say that's right? What is justice? In the simplest term, justice is fairness. If it's not fair, in the simplest terms, justice is fairness. It's not fair for you to take my things or my life for no reason other than you wanted. That's not justice. However, if we're to believe that God is the epitome of righteousness, the epitome of justice, then we must also believe that his actions are righteous and just. So when God told King Saul in 1 Samuel 15 to go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have, do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. We have to believe that there's a good reason why God ordered this to be done, even if God provides no explanation. Of course, we know Saul didn't obey that order. He leaned upon his own human understanding and he let some of the Amalekites go. And that's why he was replaced by David. One of the reasons why. Here's another example. Consider his servant Job. We've all heard the story of Job. What a very, well, depending on how you look at it, it's a very tragic or heart-wrenching story. With God's permission, Satan stripped Job of all his wealth and killed most of his family in a windstorm, leaving Job with his life suffering day after day with boils, only to be guilt-tripped by so-called friends. At the end of the ordeal, God never went to Job and said, "Hey man, I'm sorry about that." You see, what happened was, no. Job never knew the reason why all this bad stuff was happening to him, and yet he had faith and put his trust in God that his ways were just. Consider Abraham. After Abraham and Sarah went 99 years of life without a child between them, God finally gives him Isaac. And before Isaac had even become a full-grown man, God tells Abraham to take Isaac up to an altar to be sacrificed. And Abraham, he's prepared to do it. Abraham was prepared to sacrifice the son he's waiting his entire life to have because God asked him to. That's faith. When you don't know the reason why, it sounds horrible, it seems unjust to us in human standards, but God said to do this, so you have faith to do it. All of it sounds kind of cruel, right? If it doesn't, I mean, why would he tell us to do this and not give us the answers? What kind of God is this? You've heard this all the time, right? What kind of God does this? What kind of God does blank? So, this is what the Bible explains. Because a lot of people, you'd be surprised, and it's funny that people who ask that, they don't go searching for the answers. They just lash out and complain, mainly to deter people away from God, where the truth is right there in the Bible if you go looking for it with an earnest heart. I mean, you can go looking for it and read it and still not believe it because you've already hardened your heart. But if you go with the earnest heart and actually read it, yeah, the answer's right there. Because what if I told you that the Amalekites that God told Saul to destroy, when Israel, they had just come out of Egypt, the Amalekites, they attacked and antagonized God's people. Think about it. Israelites, they're in the wilderness. They had just escaped from Egyptian bondage, toiling in the wilderness. Then here comes this nomadic tribe raiding and attacking the Israelites. You gotta believe there were people killed, massacred, people dragged off, all kinds of bad stuff happening to God's people. God saw this, and out of love and a strong desire to protect his people, a strong desire to avenge his people, he said in Exodus 17 verse 14, "I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." That's what he said. All right, Rock, what about Job? All right, what if I told you that God knew Job so well that he knew Job could withstand the suffering and disasters? In Job chapter 1 verse 8, God himself said, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" God himself said this about one of us human beings. Do you think he would have approved of his 6,000 plus livestock getting wiped out or the death of all 10 of his children if he didn't think Job could handle it? And what if I told you that Abraham, he heard a voice call out to him in Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 through 3, where God tells this man to leave his country, go uproot himself, him and his kindred, to a distant land where he planned to give him. He promises to bless Abraham and make his name great. God gave him Isaac, even though Sarah was 99 years old. God took Abraham to Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham himself witnessed with his own two eyes a spectacular destruction, the likes of which no one's ever seen. If this almighty God told you to go up and sacrifice your son, knowing full well what God was capable of, which of you would tell me you would disobey him? Think about it. You see Sodom and Gomorrah get obliterated in the most spectacular supernatural way, and then the same God that did this tells you to sacrifice your son. Like, you gotta be foolish not to, right? That's one way of looking at it. But could it be that in Abraham's close personal relationship with God, Abraham trusted that the sacrifice of Isaac would have been for a good reason? Could it be that Abraham has such faith that he knew that if God wanted to, he could have easily resurrected Isaac or healed him? Well, hold on, Rock. Why would God allow these things to happen to his servants to begin with? For us. Don't you see? Remember when Jesus Christ came across that blind man who was blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus said, neither. For the man existed so that the works of God might be manifest in him. That's John 9:3. What this means is that God uses these servants so that all of us as human beings can see and know God's power and works. Think about it. What was it that the Pharisees kept asking of Jesus? Give us a sign that you really are the Messiah. What do we keep hearing from skeptics and non-believers today? Give us evidence that God exists. Give us proof. Where's the proof? I don't believe in God because there's no proof. There's no evidence anywhere. That's what they say, right? We live in times where we don't see seas being parted down the middle. No one's been resurrected after being dead for 3 days in over 2,000 years. God knows who we are better than we know ourselves. The Bible is for us who haven't seen and yet believe. In reading the Bible and taking it to heart, we become witnesses to what has happened to those who came before us. It's like we're toddlers to big brothers. And the prophets and the servants of old, they're our big brothers. We witness their pain, their suffering, their sacrifice, their adversity, and how they overcame it all. In witnessing what Job and Abraham went through, we learn the lessons about God's character and ourselves. Look at the Me Too movement. #BelieveAllWomen. If I hadn't read the Bible and stumbled across the false allegation of Potiphar's wife levied against Joseph, I imagine it would have been 10 times more frustrating with these movements. But in so doing, I've become very grateful that the false accusation I face didn't land me in prison for 3 years the way it did Joseph. Matter of fact, yeah, I came off pretty unscathed. When you've come to know who God is and how he imprinted on us more than just his appearance, I won't say that you're no longer upset or angered by the injustices going on in the world, but more or less, it's easier for you to relax and let go of those injustices. It also helps you feel less shame for all the God-given emotions that we feel. Like, these are natural feelings that we have because he gave it to us. Hate, anger, rage, jealousy, envy, spite, selfishness. These are all negative emotions. So why do we have them? Could it be that God gave us these emotions to use as tools? Like a hammer, you can use it to construct and build something up or destroy something. The Bible teaches us to avoid some of these emotions, but God knows we have them. They can be powerful motivators to uplift us and prompt us to forge ahead. And in reading the Bible, I believe you can be taught to use these emotions properly. By these emotions, I'm talking about those negative ones, hate, anger, and rage. You can use it properly. I'll give you an example. This is kind of off track, but I used to weigh 378 pounds. And it took 4 years of me hitting the gym to get down to 220. And when people ask, Rock, what was your motivation? How were you able to stick to it? How were you able to keep the weight off? I tell them that, women is a big motivator. I want to attract a beautiful woman, but at the same time, there's a lot of anger that kept me in a gym. I can tell you, I'm not too proud of it, but even when I kept the weight off from the age of probably 25 to 27, I was going through a lot of crap with a lot of people in my life, and I used the rage and anger because it was a lot of injustice. There was a lot of stuff where I couldn't do anything. I did what I could, but I had to just forgive. Like, we live in a very wicked system where, wicked people move ahead. And when you see that and there's nothing you can do, of course you're going to be angry. So what do? You direct it. You use it as motivation. You turn it into a fuel for production. That's what I learned when I was 17. Again, kind of off beaten path, but I was 17, found out my dad told courts that I wasn't his real son, and other bad stuff that happened. There was a lot of rage, even towards religion. And my drama coach, my teacher when I was 17, told me, Rock, you have a lot of potential. I really think you should use this as motivation to succeed, to hurry up and graduate and get up out of this house and leave this toxic environment to go and do your own thing. And sure enough, because before then, all I had was Disney, right? The Disney, the Family Matters, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. My parents kind of kept me in that bubble. And it's like all of those dramas, the people ran on positive energy. There were families that were supporting them. Oh, you want to do this? Okay, I'm gonna help you do this. My family was not like that. My family wanted me to do something. If I didn't want to do that, then there was something wrong with me. I'm being a little too harsh there. And my family's not the way they used to be, so please forgive them. Don't hold them against that. But I'll leave you with this. In Acts chapter 14, verse 15 through 17. The Apostle Paul is in the city of Lystra. This is in present-day Turkey. After performing a miracle where Paul cured a cripple who since birth was never able to walk, the people tried to worship Paul and his companion Barnabas as visiting gods. You got to figure this is back in the time where you still had people like, you still had Roman myths. You still had Julius Caesar and his Octavian Augustus, and they were worshiping people or myths like Ares and the god of war and Dionysus and all of that. So when they try to worship Paul and Barnabas as visiting gods because they cured this man who was crippled since birth, Paul rebuked them. This is what he said. I love these words. Why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn away from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And in verse 16, Paul said, in past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Verse 16 tells me, that scripture, that tells me that just because the Bible focuses on the Israelites in that region that we all know as the Middle East, it doesn't mean that he hasn't had a hand in the lives of all nations. Think Genghis Khan, think, I can't pronounce his name, but the first emperor of China, or the Tokugawa shogunate. All of these people who had no clue, never heard about Jesus Christ, and they wouldn't have heard about him for hundreds and hundreds of years after Jesus Christ had died. Verse 16 tells me that God still played a part in their lives, whether they knew his name or not. So when I encounter atheists or non-believers who seem to be good, moral, upstanding people, it makes sense. They may not believe, and I won't offend them by shoving my belief down their throat, but I know that all good people with a strong moral code of what's right and wrong are merely adhering to the principles that God put in all of our hearts. This is what the Bible's taught me from reading it from cover to cover.